Hey everybody, this is Eric Rosier from Virtual Devices, here to talk to you today about pedal boards. To me, a pedal board is a very personalized piece of your rig. There's millions of ways you can curate your sound just by the chain of your pedals on your board and switching them in and out, turning them on and off. It's just a lot of fun to me. I've built my fair share of them through the years, from homemade wooden ones to ones you can buy off the shelf. Lately, I've been using the Temple audio boards because the features they have built into it, like the side jacks and the mounting plate system, they're made from aluminum sheet metal, so
very high strength to weight ratio.
I take a lot of time to properly design and lay out my boards, and today we're going to go through my top 12 Temple board hacks. Alright, today I'll be using a Temple Audio Duo 24. I've done most of the modifications already because it takes some time and it's not really fun to watch. So we'll just step through the tips real quick. Tip number 1, remove the side plate screws and replace with through bolts. These guys over here, you can see, are very tiny screws that come with these things. The original screws are an M3 by 0.5 millimeter pitch. The height of those screws is 2.5 millimeters. So doing the math out, that gives you 5 total threads. There's an imperfect thread at the top for the lead in and at the bottom for the lead out underneath the head. So you really only get about 3 threads of full engagement, which normally is fine. But in this case, when you plug and unplug your cables, it's loading these threads axially. Since it's also a steel screw in an aluminum hole, it has a tendency to wear faster. So the more times you want to change your setup as well, the more chances you have for it stripping and making that bay unusable. I've made several of these unusable in the past, and that's why I decided to get rid of them and go with the through bolt used pretty on. Typically I'll use an M3 by 12 millimeter bolt, drill out the hole from the side using a 1/8 drill bit, since I don't have a metric set, and I'll use a nylon lock nut as well to be able to keep that thing in longer for much longer periods of time. With the power cable unit they supply here, you have I had to use an M2 bolt because there's an access issue between the side of this housing and where this hole sits. So I went with an M2. I was able to get the nut in there. It was pretty difficult because they're very, very small. But if you don't want to deal with that, you could turn it around and put the nuts on the outside of the housing as well. And that's one way to do it. I went with this just because I wanted a better aesthetic. Now this leads us to tip number 2. Replace the screws that hold the handle on with cap screws. The screws that are given for the handles are M4 with a Phillips head, shown here, and they're difficult to access because of the bottom side of the brace. Since you don't have line of sight access to get to it when it's fully torqued, they tend to both cross-thread the handles during installation, and the Phillips head gets stripped, making it difficult to remove. You can use something like a right-angle screwdriver, like this, but the head stripping potential is a big reason why I changed the socket cap bolts. I like to replace these with socket caps because the hex key can get into those tight areas. As you can see here, much easier to get into, a lot of clearance, and it has much more resistance to stripping the head. So make sure you choose the proper length for your application. M4 by 12 millimeter is a good replacement for the cap screws supplied. And that brings us to tip number 3. Alright, tip number 3 is to add spacers underneath the handles when you have side jack access issues. So for this board that I'm building, I like to put the wah up against the side brace. Actually, that's technically tip number 3 and number 4. So tip number 4 is to put the wah pedal up against the sides because the side pieces help stiffen it, and it won't flex as much when you put your weight on it to use the wah. So when doing a board of this size, the input jack tends to have clearance issues with the handle here. So that's why I like to add in some spacers. And I got these, I think, from an IKEA furniture set. I'm sure you can find some plastic spacers or metal spacers or something off the internet. But that's what I like to use. But when doing this, remember that you're going to have to increase the length of the bolt that you use on the underside so that M4 by 12 millimeter probably won't be long enough. Tip number 5, replace the feet at the top of the board with longer ones. This is going to give you a slightly better angle, and it's going to give you just a little bit more room underneath. So with taller power supplies, your placement can get limited because of the ground clearance. If you're not using the Seox system that they just came out with, the one that uses the side bays, a quick trick to buy you some more space is to jack up the front end with taller rubber feet. I use longer ones here, and you can see the difference in height with the ones that come with it. Alright, back to the side is tip number 6, where we're going to color coordinate your connections. I typically change out the colored cliff nuts on the side jacks and color coordinate on the other end of the amp as well, so I know where everything is supposed to go. As you can see here, the original comes with red on one side and black on the other. I used red, blue, green, and yellow here, but you can also swap out the black ones on the other side if you only have the ones that came with it. But this really just helps with cable connections, and really helps out in gig scenarios where I need to get on and off the stage fast. For this next tip, I had to pull out a board that I have already built because I'm not going to put the lights on the board that I am building right now. But tip number 7 is to use super glue on the light strips. So if you want to put these fancy light strips that Temple board makes right here, the 3M adhesive that comes on with it isn't really good enough to keep it in place for long periods of time. So I use super glue or a clear drying adhesive strong enough to keep it in place. Epoxy's one that's pretty strong. Gorilla Glue is another great one. So I usually put these underneath the front side right here so that it doesn't blind me when I'm looking down at it. That way, you can see. Alright, back to the board that I'm building. So tip number 8. When possible, don't use their mounting plate system. Use the attachments to the pedal itself. The best example of this shown here, I'm not sure how well you can see, but the Dunlop/Vox wah housing. The screws for the bottom plate somehow line up perfectly with the holes in the Temple board. So you just need to remove the screw from the wah itself, remove the rubber bumper, line it up and tighten it down. So you can see here I did the top 2 already, and it keeps it in place. Another example is the Sennheiser wireless receiver tuner. They had the foresight to put in mounting holes, and they even tell you what the screw sizes you should use. That was pretty cool. There's others that work as well. You'll have to check it, but even as good as their mounting plate system is, the most secure way to fasten your pedal to the board is to use the fasteners to the pedal itself. Alright, tip number 9. Mounting the power supply using brackets. Aside from the Seox systems that are made for the side bays, Voodoo Lab has a bracket that's been made by Temple to attach directly to their boards. But be careful with Voodoo Lab power supplies. Some of them are not shielded, so they give off some EMF signals that get into the signal chain. I've had problems with them in the past, and the answer is to mount them on the top, but then I lose the real estate that I was banking on by having it mounted underneath. Dunlop, MXR, True Tone, T-Rex, and Walrus Audio are brands that I've used that mounted underneath I haven't had any issues with, but I haven't tried them all, so I can't say for sure. And the same goes for Voodoo Lab. I haven't tried all their models. The ones that I have used I've had problems with, so I tend to steer clear of those. The mounting plates that can be used, but the weight of some of the power supplies, pulling away from the adhesive, along with the collection potential for dirt and grime if it's mounted underneath, has caused them to fail for me in the past. So when possible, I try to use slotted brackets to attach the power supply. That way I can secure it mechanically, and it has some wiggle room for it to be mounted. If that's impossible, I will use the mounting plates along with cleverly placed zip ties so you just can't see it very well. But while we're talking on power, let's move to tip number 10. Tip number 10, connecting the power. So the IEC power cables on the Temple modules are great, see here, but the problem is that they are straight and not a right angle. So I'm having problems with placement and access again because this is as far back as I can get it. And since this one is a particularly tall supply, I'm going to have problems with ground clearance, so I want to push this back as far as I can. So you can do several things to connect it. One of the things you can do is get an adapter like this guy, which one end is the IEC, the other end is just a normal cable, and you can get yourself a short right angle cable and use that as the jumper. I'll probably do that on this board, but Temple, if you're watching this, please make these right angles. It's so much easier. So the other thing that I'm going to do is on boards that I'm taking to shows, I'm not going to show it here, but typically I'll put a power strip on the back of this, and that gives me a bunch of different power options. So it gives me the ability to add side charging, like a phone charging jack, a wireless bug charging jack if I'm using a wireless system, or I've even made these optional AC outlets that you can put in on the other side, and you can power the whole front of the stage if you had to. I like doing that because my other guitarist could then plug his pedal board into it if there's no front of stage power. So it's been handy in the past, and sometimes I have to leave my board up there for the entire show so all the bands can plug into it because there's no front of stage power. Alright, we're going to go back to a board that I've already built for tip number 11, which is to hardwire other connections when possible to the side jacks. So here you can see the different side jacks that I have that aren't straight quarter-inch connectors. I have a USB. This one in particular, this goes to a Boss MS3, which you can unlock its potential by connecting it to a computer. So in this case, once all the pedals are down and attached and all the wiring is secured, it can be very difficult to access your pedals when you want to go into the inner workings with using a computer or something. So in this case, I've wired the USB connection to the side jack, so all I have to do is plug into the side when I want to connect to it. This is the Temple Audio power that they use that pulls power from your power supply and charges your phone. And this is an XLR because as a bass player, I'm going to need a DI. So these Neutrik jacks right here, these can be flipped around so that you have either this one or this side coming out. It all depends on what you want to connect to it. Now for my final tip number 12, use cable clamps to tidy up the wiring. So for Temple boards, I like to use these cable clamps here. That helps me keep the wires in place, and I get to use a socket cap screw usually through any of the open bolt holes that aren't being used by a pedal. The classic method is to use these adhesive tie mounts, which will work, and they'll tidy everything up real nice. But every time you change something, or if you have a bad wire, you have to cut the zip tie and redo it all. So with this clamp method, I can just unbolt to remove, add wiring, is whatever I need to do. And it also gives it slack so it doesn't break as easily, because these things tend to tie down, and if you depending on how tight you get them, you could put some undue pressure that you weren't planning on the wires. So there you have it. Those are my top 12 tips for building a Temple board. So if you want to see these boards in action, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and go to our website, www.vnvrocks.com, for the latest in what we're doing. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. And for Virtue and Vices, this is Eric signing off.